So as you can see, I'm not in my office, and that's actually on purpose, because even though many of our house churches, they're taking a break for the summer, we're still going to keep going verse by verse through the Old Testament. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, several of our house churches are still meeting throughout the summer. But second, and honestly more importantly, we want to stay on track to teach through the Bible, through the entire Bible. And we're never going to get through it if we hit pause for the summer each year. So if your house church is taking the summer break, I'd encourage you, don't stop growing. Just keep watching these studies on your own, and you can talk about them with your spouse or with a friend. But just keep engaging with God's Word. And I decided for the summer, I thought I would just do these messages while taking a walk. I don't know. It's just a little more informal. Let me know if you like it or not. But I kind of like it because I like to get outside during the summer. But with all that said, let's just jump right back into Genesis chapter 40. And so this week, it's back with Joseph, and he's in this unbelievably unfair situation. In fact, if there's one word that we could use to describe Joseph's life, it'd be unfair. I mean, his whole life, it's all just been unfair. I mean, think about it. He was sold into slavery by his brothers. I mean, that's unfair. And now he's sitting in a prison because of a false accusation, all while trying to do the right thing. And that's unfair. I mean, you talk about unfair. And as I studied this passage, it really got me thinking about the way that our society, that our culture responds to unfairness. I mean, think about it. How does our world teach us to react when things are unfair? Well, they teach us to act like this.
We want justice! Now! We want justice! What do we want it now? What do we want justice? What do we want it now? What do we want justice? What do we want it now? What do we want justice? What do we want it now?
So our society is obsessed with fairness. I mean, it could be a law, it could be an event, it could be some political opinion. If anything, even a person is labeled unfair, well, people will march, they'll protest, they'll rage online, and they'll demand change and until they get what they want. But here's the hard truth, is that God is not obsessed with fairness. I mean, what's fair or what's unfair is not his highest priority. And honestly, that clashes with everything that our culture believes. In fact, as we've been learning on Sunday mornings in our verse-by-verse study through the Gospel of Matthew, the values of the kingdom of God, they often stand in direct opposition to the values of the world. I mean, God constantly turns upside down what the world values, what it fights for, what they chase after, what they celebrate. And we're going to see that same tension here in the life of Joseph. I mean, Joseph, he's sitting in prison because he did the right thing, falsely accused, forgotten, treated unjustly. And yet this story, it's not ultimately about fairness. It's about surrender. Because Genesis chapter 40, it teaches us that this powerful truth. God is less concerned with what feels fair to us, and he's more concerned with whether our hearts are fully surrendered to him. So let's pick it up where we left off last time in chapter 40, verse 1. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Now, we're not told exactly what they did, only that they somehow offended Pharaoh. That's a bad thing. And it may have been something as simple as appearing sad in the king's presence, which in the ancient world, that was considered a serious offense because these weren't just ordinary servants. The chief baker, obviously he oversaw the preparation of what the king consumed, while the chief cupbearer, he tasted and actually served the king's drink to ensure that it hadn't been poisoned. In other words, these men lived dangerously close to power. And with that closeness came tremendous pressure and accountability. And you could imagine that one suspicious incident, one bad day or one rumor of an attempted poisoning, it could have life or death consequences. And most likely, they were thrown into prison under suspicion of conspiracy or even attempted murder against Pharaoh. But from God's perspective, they weren't there by accident. They were there because God sovereignly ordained them to meet Joseph. Verse 2, Pharaoh was angry with his two officials. By the way, that word there for official, that's the same word that was used to describe Potiphar, which is the Hebrew word for eunuch. So it could read, Pharaoh was angry with his two eunuchs, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. Well, in the ancient world, kings, they'd often make high-ranking officials eunuchs, not only to keep them away from the king's wives and concubines, but also as a sign of absolute loyalty and total devotion to the throne. And yet, despite their position and their sacrifice, personal sacrifice, these men, they still found themselves arrested and thrown into prison. Now, stop and think about this for a moment. Was any of this an accident? Well, obviously, absolutely not. I mean, if we've learned anything in Genesis, we've learned that nothing is accidental. It wasn't an accident that Joseph was favored by his father. It wasn't an accident that his brothers became jealous. It wasn't an accident that Joseph was sold into slavery. It wasn't an accident that he was sold specifically to Potiphar. It wasn't an accident that Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him. It wasn't an accident that Joseph was thrown into this particular prison. It was no accident that Pharaoh became angry with these two particular men. And it wasn't an accident that they ended up in the very same prison as Joseph. None of this was fair, but none of it was accidental. And here's the deeper truth. It's not just that God allowed these events to happen. I mean, Scripture shows us that. In His sovereignty, God intentionally permitted every one of these unfair moments as a part of His greater purpose. And Joseph, he couldn't yet see it. Because remember, God, His highest priority, it's not our comfort. It's not our convenience. It's not even what we define as fairness. God is after something deeper, a heart that's fully surrendered to Him. Verse 4 continues. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night. And each dream had a meaning of its own. Again, these dreams they're no accident. By now, are you getting a sense that the dreams are incredibly important in the life of Joseph? Well, God repeatedly uses dreams to move Joseph's story further, not only to shape Joseph's future, but to shape his heart. But just like Joseph, we often misunderstand how God works through dreams and through promises. We see the outcome, but we don't realize those pits, those prisons, and the deserts that God may lead us through in order to prepare us for His dream. And these dreams in Genesis chapter 40, they are a perfect example of that. I mean, to one man, the dream, it's going to bring incredible news, but to the other, it's going to be devastating news. One, is going to be restored to his position of power. The other is going to die. But both dreams, the good one and the bad one, they come from God. And from a human perspective, well, that doesn't seem very fair. Well, that's because God's purposes are often bigger than our definition of what fairness is. And he's not simply orchestrating comfortable outcomes. His sovereignty, it's accomplishing his will and shaping these hearts in the process. Verse 6, when Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" Well, this gives us a powerful window into the heart of Joseph. I mean, men who are consumed with bitterness and anger and self-pity, they rarely stop to even care about anyone else or the struggles of other people. I mean, think about it. Joseph had every human reason to become inward focused, to be bitter, because he was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, forgotten in prison. It would have been so easy for him to believe that all of life should revolve around his pain, his injustice, and his wounds. But that's not what we see. Instead, Joseph, he notices other people's pain. He notices that the cupbearer and the baker, they look troubled, and he even cares enough to ask them why. Well, even in the middle of his own suffering, Joseph still had compassion for other people. That reveals a heart that had not been hardened by unfairness. It was a heart that was still surrendered to God. Verse 8, we both had dreams, they answered, but there is no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, do not all interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. Well, obviously, these dreams deeply impacted these two men. I mean, probably unlike anything they had ever experienced before. The dreams felt real. They were weighty. They were unsettling. That's because these were not ordinary dreams. I mean, God had sent them not only to shape these men, but ultimately to accomplish his sovereign purposes. And don't miss the shift happening in the story, because up until now, Joseph had been the dreamer. But now God is bringing other people's dreams into Joseph's life as a part of his unfolding plan. Now, this wasn't Joseph casually discussing dreams out of curiosity, nor was this some form of, mystical fortune telling. Joseph could see these men were deeply troubled, and he approached them with compassion and spiritual discernment, desiring to minister to their troubled souls. It's also important to remember that not every dream is a revelation from God. I mean, Scripture never encourages us to treat every random dream as a divine communication. But in this moment, God gave Joseph the gift of interpretation because it was exactly what was needed to advance his plan and continue shaping Joseph for the future that God had prepared for him. So verse 9. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, in my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and he put the cup in his hand. It's actually a pretty simple dream. I mean, the cupbearer, he sees 3 branches on a vine that suddenly bud, it blooms and blossoms and produces ripe grapes. He takes the grapes, he squeezes them into Pharaoh's cup and places the cup back into Pharaoh's hand. Now, don't miss how eager both the cupbearer and the baker are at this moment to have their dreams interpreted. Well, in ancient Egypt, dreams, they were considered extremely important because Egyptians, they believed the gods communicated through them. In fact, Egypt, They had entire books dedicated to dream interpretation, along with professional experts whose job it was, profession, to interpret dreams and omens. And here they are, sitting in a prison cell, with none of Egypt's wise men available and none of those books. All they have is this young Hebrew prisoner. But that's the point. This dream, it didn't come from the false gods of Egypt. It came from the one true God. And because the dream came from the one true God, only God could rightly interpret it. Verse 12. This is what it means, Joseph said to him. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to the position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. So, Joseph is able to interpret the cupbearer's dream, and at the same time, you can almost sense a glimmer of hope in Joseph's heart too, because God is speaking. I mean, maybe this is it for him as well. I mean, maybe this is the moment God is going to use this to finally free him from this injustice. Maybe this connection to Pharaoh's cupbearer is the breakthrough he's been waiting for. But you also have to remember the lessons Genesis keeps pressing into us over and over again. God doesn't prioritize what we define as fair. His priority is that our hearts are surrendered to him. And Joseph still has more surrendering, more waiting, and more refining ahead of him. So Joseph says, but when all goes well with you, remember me and show kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews. And even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. So Joseph asked the cupbearer to remember him and speak on his behalf, once he's restored to Pharaoh. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with that. That wasn't showing a lack of faith in God, because it's okay to seize an opportunity when God places one in front of you. And Joseph's godly character, it shines through in prison because he refuses to become bitter or angry. But that doesn't mean that he's passive or that he's naive and blind to opportunity. I mean, he wants out of prison and he recognizes this may be an opportunity for freedom. And he wisely takes it. You can almost hear it in Joseph's voice. I mean, maybe, just maybe, this is the end of the desert. Maybe this is finally my way out. But notice something important. The cupbearer never actually promises Joseph anything. He doesn't say, hey, absolutely, bro, I got you. There's no firm commitment. And once again, the story reminds us that life, it doesn't unfold the way that feels fair. Rarely ever. But Genesis, it keeps pressing that same truth into our hearts, that God, his primary concern is not our definition of fairness, but rather his priority is that our hearts remain surrendered to him in the middle of the waiting. Verse 16, when the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation. Remember how we tend to picture our future, a smooth and paved road, an easy road leading straight to the summit of success. We imagine the dream, the promotion, the breakthrough, the mountaintop. But rarely do we picture the valleys, the delays, and the suffering along the way. Well, the baker, he's human too. He hears the favorable interpretation given to the cupbearer, and naturally, he wants some of the same outcome for himself. I mean, after all, from a human perspective, that only seems fair. I mean, if one man gets restored to his position, I mean, surely the other should too, right? When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. And in the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. Again, pretty simple dream. The baker, he sees 3 baskets stacked on his head. And once again, the number 3 appears. Numbers matter to God. And in the top basket are baked goods prepared for Pharaoh. But instead of Pharaoh eating them, birds come and they begin eating the food out of the basket. So the imagery is simple, but a little bit unsettling. And what does this mean? I mean, something meant for Pharaoh never reaches him. And the baker is unable to protect what was entrusted to him. So the question remains, what does this dream mean? Well, verse 18. This is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole. Ugh. And all the birds, they'll eat away your flesh. Well, it's safe to say this was not the interpretation that the baker was hoping for. But notice something important about Joseph. He was still faithful to deliver a message of judgment as he was a message of deliverance. He didn't soften the truth. He didn't change the interpretation just to spare feelings. And he didn't manipulate, God's message to make it more palatable or more comfortable. And that's the mark of a godly messenger, someone who faithfully communicates the whole truth of God, even when it's difficult to hear. Because anyone can deliver good news to people. That's easy when people want to hear it. But spiritual maturity, it's revealed when someone is willing to speak truth honestly, humbly, yet faithfully, even when that message is hard. Verse 20. Now the 3rd day, it was Pharaoh's birthday. Is that an accident that the dreams that God sent were given 3 days before Pharaoh's birthday and then they came true on that 3rd day? Of course not. I mean, once again, we see the precise sovereignty of God, orchestrating events down to the smallest detail. And so often in the Old Testament, we see echoes and patterns that ultimately point us forward to the cross. And that's one of the great lessons repeated again and again in this. Even in the most painful, confusing, and unfair moments, God is still in control. He's still pulling the strings behind the scenes. And God allows suffering, injustice, and waiting and hardship in our lives. Not because He's lost control, but rather because His purposes, they're deeper than our temporary comfort. Because God, His ultimate priority, it's not fairness, it is surrender. And honestly, have you ever stopped to think about what those 3 days must have been like for the cupbearer and then the baker? I mean, 3 days, long days of waiting, 3 days of wondering if these predictions would be true. I mean, one man, 3 days of hope, and one man, 3 days of despair. One man waiting for restoration, the other waiting for death. Can you imagine trying to sleep at night after hearing Joseph's interpretation? I can't. Well, verse 20 continues. Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all of his officials. He lifted the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer into his position, so that once again he put the cup into Pharaoh's hands. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. By the way, the fact that one man was restored to his position while the other man was executed, it doesn't necessarily mean one was more guilty than the other. In the ancient world, kings like Pharaoh often used public celebrations such as birthdays as opportunities to display their power and their authority through acts of clemency and justice. A prisoner, he might be pardoned. Another might be executed. And sometimes the decision, it can feel almost arbitrary from a human perspective. In other words, it could almost feel as random as drawing names out of a hat. Is that fair? Of course not. But that's the reality of living in a fallen world. We live in a broken world where outcomes are not always equal. Justice, it's not always immediate. And circumstances often feel painfully uneven. And Genesis, it keeps reminding us that even in the middle of unfairness, God, he's still sovereign. And he's still at work accomplishing purposes bigger than what we can presently understand. Well, verse 23. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. The chief cupbearer, he forgets Joseph the moment he's restored to freedom. I mean, Joseph, remember, had asked him to remember him before Pharaoh. But once the cupbearer, his own life was back on track, Joseph, his memory faded into the background. And to be fair, I mean, the cupbearer never actually promised Joseph anything. He never gave his word. And Joseph, remember, he kind of just hoped that this man would remember him. Still, from Joseph's perspective, imagine how lonely that room felt. It had to feel crushing. Another disappointment, another delay, another desert, another unfair turn in a long line of painful circumstances. And it doesn't seem fair, does it? It doesn't seem right, but it was reality. And once again, Genesis presses that same lesson into our hearts, is that God, his primary concern isn't whether or not it feels fair to us. His concern is that our heart, it remains surrendered to him, even in the waiting, even in the disappointment, and even when people let us down. And to close, I want to just peek ahead to the next verse in chapter 41. Chapter 41, verse 1. Look at this. When 2 full years had passed, 2 years, Joseph, he'd suffer in prison for 2 more years after being forgotten. And don't brush past that. 2 years? That's a long time. Just ask anyone who has spent 2 years in prison, especially in an ancient Egyptian dungeon full of dark, filthy, damp, crawling with rats and spiders. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? I mean, hope, it had seemed so close. Freedom, it felt like it was within reach. And maybe Joseph thought, this is finally it. God is finally going to get me out. But then the door slammed shut again. Can you relate to that feeling? I know I can. I mean, is there anything more discouraging than almost getting that, that breakthrough? Everybody wants a breakthrough, only to end up back again at ground zero, forgotten, put on the shelf, left up dry in a prison cell, while life just moves on without you. And meanwhile, the very man who forgot Joseph, he's thriving. He's restored to a place of honor, comfort, and success, thriving while Joseph suffers. And that's not fair. And when life feels unfair, our natural tendency is bitterness, jealousy, gossip, resentment, tearing down other people, tearing down their success, because deep down we hurt. But what we often fail to realize is that the very places that God uses to transform us and refine us and prepare us for purposes we can't see yet, at prison time, it's never wasted. Because that waiting, it's not pointless. The disappointment, it's not meaningless. Just look at Joseph's life. Because God was preparing Joseph for a purpose bigger than Joseph could possibly imagine. That parallels what we read in the New Testament in James chapter 1, when James writes, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance, and perseverance must complete its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Perseverance, it means enduring patience. And what a contrast that is to our world, obsessed with fairness, instant results, and demanding their rights. Joseph could have become angry and bitter. He could have protested. No justice, no peace. He could have given up on God entirely. That's because that's how the world responds to unfairness. Because anger, it feels empowering. Bitterness feels justified. And we feel strong when we demand what we think we deserve. But if Joseph had settled for the world's response to suffering, he would have missed what God was actually doing beneath the surface. God was preparing him, refining him, shaping his character for a purpose that Joseph he couldn't yet imagine. And that's the tension that Genesis keeps pressing us into. It's that God, his highest priority, is never what feels fair in the moment. He cares that our hearts are fully surrendered to him through the process.